Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tara East. I'm a creative writing teacher, blogger, YouTuber, and author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. So since we're in December, I wanted to do something kind of different for this video. So I went through my list of all the books that I've read this year. And I just thought about what lessons in particular could a writer garner from these books. When it comes to writing, one of the best things you can do for yourself is to be a reader, because when you read a lot of books, you understand how story functions, and you can also study particular books that do things very well that maybe you're trying to develop still as a writer. So for example, let's say you are the kind of writer who isn't very good at character. Well, then you would want to go and find books that have really well-developed characters in them. The characters have a lot of personality, they feel real, they're complex, and they really impact the story. They're really informing the story. The same goes for plot. Maybe you're not very good at plot, so then you would want to study books that are very plot forward. The first book that I want to mention is one that I read way back in January called The Nothing Man by Catherine Ryan Howard. So this is probably the best crime novel I've ever read, and if you are someone who is writing either a thriller novel, a crime novel, or a mystery novel, this can be an excellent book to study in terms of how can I write a book in this category that is filling the tropes of the category, that is meeting readers' expectations, that behaves as a book within this category, and yet the book actually has something to say. Now, most people probably read books in the thriller, crime, or mystery categories because they love the high stakes, the tension, and the puzzle aspect of the book. What's really interesting about this book is that we have two POVs, and we know from the very beginning who the bad guy is. This is not a whodunit. The tension is more created out of when and how are these two POVs going to collide? Now, what I really loved about this book, and what I think writers in this category could potentially learn, is how do you write a book that is fulfilling all of the tropes associated with this genre? How do you meet a reader's expectations? Because we have particular expectations when we read in this category. And yet the novel is still saying something. It has a particular message. It's not hitting the reader over the head with the message, but the message is very clearly stated. There is more that I would say on that, but it would get into massive spoiler territory. So if you're writing in this category and if these ideas are appealing to you, then I highly recommend reading The Nothing Man. And it's also fantastic on audio. Next, I want to talk about Yellowface by Rebecca Kuang. Now, personally, I think every reader should just read this book because of the topic that it's tackling. I would really recommend this book to anyone who wants to write an issue-based novel. So how do you take a real-world issue, a conversation that is happening in a social or cultural context or a political context, and how do you actually make a story out of it? How can you come at that issue from multiple angles and show the nuance of it? And how can you do that in a way that is entertaining and it doesn't feel educational? Editing Tara here. So the word I was really reaching for was didactic. So how do you write an issue-based book that is not didactic? How can you explore an issue in a novel in a way that feels really organic and as though you are telling a story and you're not just preaching into your reader's face? Instead, people are getting to experience the issue rather than being told what to think. I also think Yellowface is an excellent example of how you can have a first-person narrator who is not likable, and yet the readers will develop some kind of empathy for them, and at different times, we understand their logic even if we don't agree with it. Now we're doing a complete left turn. Next we have The Shadow of the Gods by John Quinn. So I'm going to recommend this book for one very specific reason. I think this book did many things very well, but it was the fight scenes in this book that stood out the most to me. They were super realistic in terms of how brutal they were and how chaotic they were. They were not stylish, perfectly choreographed fight scenes the way we sometimes have them in either books and certainly in TV and film. I felt as though the fight scenes were so real because whoever survived and whoever didn't survive a fight scene often came down to chance rather than skill. If you were someone who is writing fantasy or an action book of some kind, then you could really benefit from studying the fight scenes in The Shadow of the Gods. Okay, so the next book I want to recommend, and I had seesawed about this, but I'm gonna do it, is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, if you struggle with plotting. So obviously this book is known as a romantasy, but what this book does in particular that is really good is the plotting. In every single scene in this book, there is usually 3 to 4 story threads that are kept present in the scene, and the book moves at a really cracking pace. I gotta admit, when I first started reading this book, I actually found the pacing too fast because it's really different to a lot of the kinds of books that I typically read. But if you struggle with plot, I think it's a great one to look at because we're constantly moving forward, and Yarros does a really good job of collapsing time and speeding things up. When I think back on this book, I can't really think of any scenes that felt unnecessary or useless. I know there's been a lot of other fantasy books that I've read where you can tell that the author's just gone off on a tangent or they're just indulging themselves with the scene that they're describing. Whereas with Fourth Wing, I really felt like there was no fat. Every scene was really serving some kind of purpose and it was all serving the greater plot or plots. So I think it's a really good one to study if figuring out how to keep high stakes in particular, high stakes and tension alive in your narrative. How can you construct a world that innately has built into it obstacles for your character to interact with and to overcome? And how can you create a character that is either internally or externally at odds with that world? I also think Fourth Wing is a really clear example of how the world building is directly informing the plot. Another reason in particular why I recommended this book is because it's really accessible. Anybody could read this book. There's really no barrier. It's written in a very contemporary voice, which some people don't like and have complained about. But for that reason, again, it's really accessible. So if you're someone who is writing fantasy, it could be a good one to look at. Though I will say, if you're writing high fantasy, maybe give this one a miss. Now I'm going to say something that's going to sound contradictory. So Fourth Wing does a good job of having created a world that directly informs the plot. So if this book was set in a completely different world, then the current plot would dissolve because it's so heavily tied to the particular world that Rebecca Yarros has written. However, if you struggle with world building, I would not necessarily recommend this book because the world building is very light in this book and you only get as much as you actually need to understand what's happening in any particular scene. If world building is something that you maybe struggle with, I would consider looking at other titles such as N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which I will also talk about a little bit later. So next, this might seem a bit odd, but I'm keeping true to what books I read this year. I read book 2 and book 3 of V.E. Schwab's A Darker Shade of Magic series. So those books that I read are called A Gathering of Shadows and A Conjuring of Light. So this is maybe a little bit irrelevant. Overall, I'm a little uncertain of what I think about this series. I might need to spend a little bit more time processing it. I'm not really sure if I like this series or if I don't, but some things that I do have to say is that on the sentence level, the writing is fantastic. V.E. Schwab writes beautiful sentences, beautiful prose, and more than often I was underlining something because it was such a great turn of phrase. And this is something that I often find with a lot of fantasy books, is that character and plot are put above the quality of the writing. So for example, I was just talking about Fourth Wing. There are many things that Fourth Wing does really well, like plot, but on the sentence level, I don't think it's very strong. And conversely, the entire Darker Shade of Magic series, it is beautifully written and it has good plot and character. So something V.E. Schwab does quite well is she creates plots that are really character-driven and character-focused. She's created this entire world, or worlds, I should say, in this series, and yet we're really centered and really focused on 2 to 3 characters, and we're very much seeing how the decisions they make are actually creating the plot. Sometimes they are responding to things, but often they are just responding to the consequences of previous decisions. So for example, in Fourth Wing, the plot is really created out of the world and the circumstances that the character is in, but in A Darker Shade of Magic, the characters are really responding to their own decisions and to their own choices. And of course, the plot is still informed by the world that these characters live in, but I feel like the plot isn't dependent on this exact world. Like we could have played with that world, moved the shapes around, and the plot would not necessarily have changed that much. But that's maybe just my opinion. So the next book I want to talk about is Bunny by Mona Awad. So the book is definitely making fun of creative writing programs. It uses a lot of dark humor and there's a good sprinkling of horror throughout the book. But I would recommend this book to anyone who is doing something kind of experimental in their fiction. If you are the kind of person who, in your book, you are testing the boundaries with your character, with your plot, with your story. You're testing the boundaries around what is real and what isn't real. So if you are writing something that has a lot of ambiguity in it, and that doesn't finish with a big tidy bow or any clear answers around what is happening and what isn't happening, then this could be a really good book to study. I've already spent a little bit of time in this video talking about books that can help you with plotting, but not everybody writes their books with plot in mind. Instead, you might be more emotionally driven, or you might be more driven by, say, imagery, mood, things like that. If you are that kind of writer, then potentially House of Hollow by Kristen Sutherland could be really supportive for you. It seems as though the book is much more about the emotions that are invoked and the imagery and the mood than it is about the plot. Even though there is, of course, a plot in this novel, it feels as though when you're reading it, it's much more of an exploration as a character moves through their emotions, and the entire book is really image heavy. Editing Tara again. So I just wanted to add in here that in interviews, the author shared that while she was writing the book, she was really circling around these same 4 or 5 words. Words like rot, botanical, grey, smoky, and that's really why the book is so focused in terms of its aesthetic and why it's so sensory and image heavy. And it could be a good one to study in terms of how can you write a book that is emotionally generated and yet create narrative drive. So how would you maybe structure a plot when what's leading you is imagery, mood, and emotion, rather than, say, brainstorming a bunch of events or obstacles for your character to overcome? How else might you generate narrative drive or tension? What's going to keep the reader reading? What's going to propel them forward? And the answer, at least in this case, that there is a mystery or a question that the character is trying to solve. So I mentioned 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin before, and now I would also like to mention alongside that book, Scythe by Neil Shusterman. So these two books are really great examples of how you can combine science fiction with fantasy in your own book. So obviously hybrid text and genre blending has become really popular in recent years, but we're maybe more used to seeing science fiction separate from fantasy because the aesthetic of these two genres kind of clashes. Usually fantasy is low technology and it's more about a magic system, whereas science fiction is very technology forward and is very informed by technology in terms of the aesthetic and in terms of the plot, the same way fantasy plots are usually informed by magic. So then how can you have these two things exist in the same story? Well, Scythe and Fifth Season are really good examples of how you can do that. And I feel like they're fairly balanced in how they deal with both the technology aspect of the world as well as the fantastical element of the world. And I would also say, and I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler, but if you are doing something pretty experimental with your POV, then Fifth Season again could be an interesting example. The next book I want to talk about is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsir Mur. So this is a great book to study if, in particular, you want to do something really voicey with your book. You want to write a voice that is hyper stylized, has a lot of attitude, and that feels really big. Like the voice is actually a huge part of the book. Now, the reason why I'm recommending this book is because, well, I think it's a great book, but if you are writing something that is hyper stylized and super voicey, that can be challenging to maintain and to sustain over the course of an entire book. And reading Gideon the Ninth might give you some examples of how do you introduce readers to this voice, and how do you then keep that voice going throughout the entire book in a way that is supportive to the plot rather than taking away from it. So that's my general list of books that you could look at if you wanted to improve particular elements of your craft. But since it's the end of the year, I thought it might also be fun to mention some of the books I've read this year and that I've loved and that maybe I didn't mention just then. So as I mentioned at the start of this video, one of the best ways to develop as a writer is to read. And one of the absolute best ways to get better as a writer is to be aware of what your weaknesses are and then find examples of books that do that thing really well and then learn from those books. So I would love to hear from you. So what books did you read this year that you felt like you learned some real craft lessons from? Did you read any books where the plot was fantastic and it made you think about your own book and your own plot? Or the characters were really fantastic? Or the setting? Or the way they dealt with theme? Or maybe the book had a really interesting structure and it made you think about how you could structure your novel. I'd love to know, so please leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching. Now go do some writing because the world actually does need more books.